We're live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. Today on the program, we have Shahid Buttar, a congressional candidate in California, challenging Nancy Pelosi. Shahid, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, John. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited for today's conversation. There's a ton of things that I wanted to cover with you, from policy to strategy to the future of the progressive movement. But the first thing I wanted to start with is, I think a lot of people have known you as a candidate, but I'd love to give them a little bit more background. This isn't your first time running for office. What were you doing before you decided to run for office, specifically Congress?
I was working at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. At the time, I spent 5 years there building a grassroots network across the country as a force multiplier for the digital rights movement. So that included, we were deploying people to participate in grassroots activism, particularly pushing states to promote policies enshrining net neutrality and including community oversight of local police surveillance acquisition and deployment. So both the digital privacy side as well as the access side of digital rights. And my contribution at EFF was particularly in proposing and then building this network. The last time I checked, I think there were 90 groups in about 30 states around the country, and their hacker collectives, their library, affinity groups of librarians, their hacker spaces, maker spaces, their 2600 clubs, their student groups, their community organizations, their post-Occupy networks, a bunch of different kinds of communities that together comprise the Electronic Frontier Alliance. So that was my work there. Before that, I was leading a national nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. At the time, it's now called Defending Rights and Dissent, and I serve on the board. But that was an organization particularly focused on fighting government surveillance through local grassroots activism and organizing, politicizing federal surveillance at the local level. And I did that for 6 years. So I spent about 20 years as an advocate and an organizer and an artist promoting the vanguard of the left's policies. And maybe the last thing I'll say just about my background is sort of how I started. And that was as when I first got to Washington as a young lawyer, having just graduated from Stanford Law School, my first cases were trying to get money out of politics. I was defending I was representing, I should say, the House co-sponsors of the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. And then I had a chance to be one of the first courtroom advocates in the country promoting the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice. And I did that long before Democrats as a whole stood up to stand for gay rights. And it's interesting today to reflect on this, with Pride, the anniversary of the Stonewall riot, at least was yesterday. And it's interesting to see how far we've come with respect to gay rights being embraced, not only by Democrats, but even by conservatives on the Supreme Court. In 2004, when my client, Jason West in New Paltz, New York, was taking marriage equality to the East Coast, you could not find a Democrat to stand with us. It was pretty slim pickings. And I'm just, noting that as a reflection of the kind of voice that I aim to offer my community, as one that will be on the front end of battles to establish human rights instead of showing up 10 years late and often too many lies short.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to be leading on these things rather than just following. We need people who are willing to take what could be considered at the time unpopular positions and turn them into the popular positions. Right. And I think a lot of the more recent experience you were also talking about in terms of surveillance and net neutrality are particularly applicable during the Trump administration. We obviously had more to do even before they had taken over, but there was specific expansions of the surveillance state under the Trump administration enabled by our fellow Democrats, as well as a complete repeal in many respects of net neutrality. So I think that's some valuable experience. Shahid, the next thing I really wanted to hear from you is, I think a lot of people have known you online from all over the country, a leader in the progressive movement, but could you help us understand more of the local scene of where you're running in California, what some of the characteristics of your district are, as well as some of the specific challenges that the people you're trying to represent are facing?
Great questions, and I appreciate you paying attention to your reflection on the Trump administration continuing and exacerbating longstanding preceding problems is one I particularly appreciate. San Francisco, I'm running in the 12th Congressional District in California, so that's just San Francisco, or I should say the northeastern 80% of it. Just a small part of the city is carved out in the 14th Congressional District. That's represented by Jackie Spear. But the majority of San Francisco and nothing beyond it is encompassed within the 12th Congressional District. So this is one of the more dense congressional districts on the West Coast. You can walk across it in 5 hours. 7 miles by about 7 miles, with again a sort of gap in it. It's one of the most progressive congressional districts in the country. This is dyed-in-the-wool blue, which is to say any blue should not do here. We have a privilege here of sending real Democrats to Washington, not corporate Democrats who abandon our communities at the first sign of political challenge, as Nancy Pelosi unfortunately has done for too long. The district here I would describe as very, to some extent, bifurcated. It is at the same time one of the wealthiest districts in the country and also one of the most destitute. We have some of the most visible reflections of the crisis in homelessness in any city in our country. And it reflects both a longstanding crisis in affordable housing here. It reflects a longstanding crisis in healthcare, because people don't always realize that a majority of people who are unhoused, the preceding event that kicked them into the street was medical bankruptcy.
Yeah.
It is the leading cause.
42%. Yep, totally.
Right. And so, these intersections between for-profit predatory healthcare and a travesty demonstrated in plain sight and a moral failing in which we are all culpable is that intersection is what I'm very compelled by. And it's very visible here in San Francisco. San Francisco is also particularly challenged by and reflective of many of the dynamics that other cities have dealt with in terms of gentrification and displacement. So the role of the real estate industry here, and frankly, shifting the composition of the city in the past, particularly 20 years, has been not insubstantial, and cities across the country are dealing with this. One question I occasionally invite audiences to consider is how much different might our affordable housing crisis look if the Democrats weren't led by a wealthy landlord? We have a wave of evictions right now that are staring our country in the face. We're about to come up on July 1st. Economies at the state level across the country have been shut down in the face of a pandemic. And there is a bill proposed by a member of the squad, Ilhan Omar, to cancel rents and mortgages and provide support to small landlords to keep people in their homes in this time of national economic crisis. Nancy Pelosi doesn't support that bill. And one might wonder why, given the exigency to keep people in their homes. And it might just be because members of Congress, again, are, by virtue of their class status or their own respective circumstances, immune effectively from the challenges that confront the rest of us. And this feature of the local landscape, housing costs, and the untenable, frankly, the pandemic, if anything, has relieved a little bit of this burden because rents started to fall in the last 2 months. But until that, every San Franciscan, even very highly compensated San Franciscans, felt a great deal of pressure from just the ridiculous cost of housing in the city. And that crisis is one in which Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, has been actively complicit for too long.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to hear, in your opinion, what can be done about that bifurcation. I have family that lives in San Francisco specifically, and they tell me the biggest challenge that they usually have is around housing, as you just mentioned beforehand. What do you think can be done from a federal level to be able to assist those in your district with housing?
Well, there's a bunch of things. I would say first, with respect to housing, there is reviving the federal block grants that incentivize property developers to include affordable units when they're building new buildings. That's basically a budget that had been established in the 70s, has slowly dried up ever since. And so we can pump more money back in that budget. And just to be clear, it's pennies relative to the obscene amounts of money that we hurl at a fraudulent military industrial establishment. So for, relative pennies, we could do a lot to keep the pipeline of new affordable units growing. We could further repeal the Faircloth Amendment and enable a substantial federal investment in new social housing, that is to say, housing owned by we the people, accountable to residents and the community. That hasn't been something that we've done in the country in the better part of 2 generations. There's a further piece here, and this was the question that I thought you were going at when you were describing healing the bifurcation. Yeah. I think, one way that we can bring people together is by replacing an era of means-tested benefits with universal programs. Means testing creates artificial separation in our society between people who have access to government benefits and those who don't. Those who don't sometimes feel slighted, whether or not that is actually the object of an underlying injustice. And universal programs not only address that tension, but they also remove the need to create administrative layers that introduce government waste and inefficiency and ultimately, in too many cases, institutional failures. a universal programs like universal healthcare, like universal education, which we have at the primary level and could through secondary education, programs like social housing, right? Housing for all. These are ways universal programs bring people together because we share in the benefits and we share in the resources that enable those benefits. And means testing, unfortunately, pits us against each other, at least in appearance, if not in fact. And that's beyond the issue of housing, because you can apply that lesson in any policy area. That's a general design principle I would bring to legislation.
I so strongly agree with that design principle. It's why I call myself a democratic universalist, because I do strongly believe that these universal programs are not only more efficient, they're more uniting, they're harder to actually kill politically because they're more popular. It's not them versus us. Exactly. And, it leaves no one out. I always ask ourselves, why are the poor doing more paperwork than the rich? And I think we've seen that, especially with the coronavirus crisis, when it came to the loans for large businesses compared to what the small businesses faced, and even the people who are looking to get unemployment benefits. There's a lot of holes that come when you focus on, you need to prove that you're poor enough to get these benefits compared to building a stable foundation. I'd love to take that another step further. I know this is not one of the ones that you mentioned beforehand, but on previous occasions, I've seen your support for universal basic income. That's something we strongly support here. I'd love to hear, in your opinion, how you would think something like that should be structured. There's been, a lot of debate in progressive circles on, removing means-tested programs to fund these types of universal basic income and other universal basic services. How would you want to structure something like that?
So the universality of UBI is something I'm particularly a fan of, and I appreciate your support for that design principle. I would like to see a UBI program that stacks on top of the guaranteed access to basic human needs. So, for instance, there are any number of human needs that are not currently acknowledged as human rights. Needs like, for instance, we've discussed a couple of them, healthcare is one that we don't acknowledge or don't provide as a right. And a UBI, when you stack it on top of those human rights to housing, food, healthcare, education, that's when it becomes liberatory. Yeah. And I'd like each of those underlying programs to also be universal. This is a, relative to where we are standing in 2020, a somewhat transformative vision with respect to the way our federal benefits are currently structured. And there are entirely, frankly, if we do away with the means testing, the amount of administrative savings we would realize by simply cutting those layers out of the equation in itself would enable a pretty vast expansion of the benefits from the current baseline.
Yeah.
And I think that in terms of how they're structured, I would put it this way: I would leave it to Congress to figure it out. I have my preferred vision of this, which is particularly, I'd like to see a $2,000 a month per person UBI. Now that's double where the sort of discussion point was at during the presidential primaries. It's more in line with what we've seen, policy discussion responding to the pandemic. And I think that if we recognize, voices have noted the inevitable encroachment of automation, particularly on, not to mention corporate outsourcing, which has already, frankly, hollowed out the American manufacturing part of the middle class. The need for us to embrace universal programs is not only increasingly compelling as time moves on, but I want to make this point: these programs can reinforce the market, or they can reinforce social needs. And this is why I'm particularly in favor of a UBI stacking on top of social services, because a UBI can be, Milton Friedman envisioned it as an attack on the social welfare state, and Dr. Martin Luther King supported it because it can be a tool to ensure human rights. And I see a lot of people coming to the idea more recently, and I'm excited to see UBI gaining that support and traction. I'm very eager to see it be more like King's vision than like Friedman's vision. And in the granular details, I'm open to, seeing what that looks like. Hopefully we can get to a place where it's more than $2,000 a month that we're proposing and considering. We certainly have the money for more. I'd love to see this conversation attached in some way to reparations. I think a committee to study reparations will have interesting ways to leverage a UBI program in ways that, are at least attempt to be compensatory for centuries of established racial injustice. So lots of opportunities for creativity here. And I don't want to close those down, but I would generally say, a UBI that adds to assured basic human needs is one that I'm especially eager to fight for in Congress.
I 1000% agree with you. And I think it is important that it goes hand in hand, universal basic services and universal basic income. One is providing that baseline security that your basic needs are being met in the services, and the other is providing that freedom for you to build upon and have the ability to invest in your own life, choose healthier options, invest in yourself, live that better life as King had proposed, as you mentioned beforehand. I'd love to transition now. We've talked about a lot of these issues, but I feel that issues is only one side of the equation. The other side is the actual politics of how do we get this done.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear, obviously we have a battle ahead versus Nancy Pelosi, but let's make the assumption that you are able to win. You're able to defeat Nancy Pelosi in the fall. What do you see as the way forward once in Congress to start enacting some of this agenda? We would love to have every single member in Congress be a progressive like yourself, but we know that's just not going to be the reality, at least in this term. How do you want to go about trying to move forward this agenda if elected?
You asked great questions. So this also has multiple components. One component of it is replacing some centrists. And I'm obviously aiming to be an agent of that and a participant in that wave. I'm not the only one. Marie Newman is knocking out Dan Lipinski. Jamal Moment is knocking out Elliot Engel. This movement has already started, and it started with the squad before us. The more of those seats we can flip, the closer we get to reclaiming the speakership from the corporate Democrats to someone like Pramila Jayapal or Barbara Lee. When an actual progressive wields the reins of the House, it's going to unlock a world of opportunities, particularly with respect to marker bills elucidating at least the contrast between transformative visions and the right wing. And that's going to redraw the battle lines of the body politic, because at the moment, Americans are socialized to consider politics as a debate between corporate Democrats and fascists. Yeah. And when we actually have socialist policies on the table and Americans can understand how else this might go down, what else our society might look like, how much more humane could this be? And at the moment, nobody knows because they never hear it, right? Nancy Pelosi is the gatekeeper to keep any kind of policy like that from ever reaching the American people, a policy like the bill to cancel rents and mortgages, right? A bill like Pramila Jayapal's bill for Medicare for All, or a bill like one to move the Green New Deal forward. These are proposals that the Democratic centrist establishment impedes. And because they impede them, they end up losing an ideological debate because they have no principle, right? So I think it would enable a great deal of downstream political education opportunities to recover the House for we the people. Another piece of this looks like working across the aisle with populists in the right wing who I do not see eye to eye with on any number of issues, but who will meet us in the middle on issues including defunding the incarceration state, defunding police, dismantling the Pentagon, and for some of them, getting money out of politics. These are all structural issues of enormous importance where we have existing transpartisan consensus in the grassroots that falls on the shoals of a bipartisan establishment that is more committed to corporate interests than it is to constituents. And so there are voices among the Freedom Caucus who would support, for instance, taking cannabis off the Federal Controlled Substances Act. And I'm very eager to do it. People in California often, take our eye off that ball because we have legal cannabis now here, and many states do, whether medical or recreational. Many states don't. And in those states, it's still used as a pretext to drive people into the gaping maw of a racist, predatory criminal injustice system. And so part of dismantling the criminal injustice system is removing these pretextual on-ramps into it. And the criminalization of cannabis is one of them. I also particularly draw a circle around that because it has intersections. When we allow legal cannabis at the federal level, it's going to unlock a wave of green jobs. It's going to unlock interstate commerce, banking services. It's going to be an economic boom for, frankly, many parts of the country. And it's going to be the kind of boom that doesn't kick anyone's grandkids off a climate cliff, right? It's a carbon sequestering plant. And if we contrast that with fossil fuel extraction and, the extractive model of wealth accumulation of preceding generations, I think there's a very compelling contrast to be offered there. Another thing, I'll make this explicit. I alluded to it before, but just to make this, I want to meet your question in the spirit it's intended. I have no qualms about showing up in other cities out of my district to speak at events promoting primary challengers to corporate centrist Democrats. It's kind of what I'm here for. I aim to be the effectuator of transitioning from a corporate dynasty into a more responsive democracy. And I am a very offensive actor. I am taking the battle for our movement into very much like the epicenter of its establishment. Nancy Pelosi isn't just a corporate Democrat. She is the corporate Democrat.
Yes.
And, by taking her out in itself, that will create opportunity.
That's such a huge signal, frankly. I think that's why this race can be so important. I would love to hear, because I loved your general approach of, we understand there's going to be a whole host of issues we're going to disagree with the right on. But we have to understand that not every issue is that, and not every person on the right is the same necessarily. And so I'd love to hear, in your opinion, sometimes I think we get unfairly labeled as the far left and therefore can't make these compromises. What, in your opinion, would be the approach for the left when it comes to we have the popularity on our side with the people, but there's some division around some of these cultural issues. Let's talk immigration. Let's talk gun control. How would you try to approach those types of issues that end up being divisive sometimes with the general public when you just keep them in simple terms?
I appreciate that. And, I'd say that alignment with libertarians on some issues presents a gateway to get to that. Let me start with surveillance, and I'll get to immigration through it. I've spent a lot of time, over 10 years, fighting government surveillance. And in the context of that work, I've often found myself greeted very warmly by ideological foes, conservatives who are concerned about the threat to their rights presented by the national security state, do not necessarily share any of my concerns with healthcare or establishing a universal right to housing or a universal right to food. They might not be interested in my agenda to promote international peace, but they recognize in particular this way in which our resources are all being mutually co-opted. And, when we look at surveillance as a particular example of people's rights being threatened, immigration enforcement and policy is very inextricably connected to surveillance in ways that people don't always understand. And so this is, one contribution I offer to the discourse as an immigrant who is also an anti-surveillance civil liberties lawyer. I can help expose and offer ways in which we immigrants are the canaries in a constitutional coal mine. And what happens to us later happens to Americans who are not immigrants. I can tell that story any number of different ways. One of them, the most compelling, I would say, relates to surveillance. So about 10 years ago, when I was leading the Bill of Rights Defense Committee in Washington, D.C., under the Obama administration, there was a program called the Secure Communities Initiative. And it was presented to towns and cities across the United States as a DHS program run through ICE to facilitate and fast track the deportation of people who'd been booked for suspicion of criminal offenses who had basically suspect immigration status or undocumented immigration status. And so people who are undocumented, who were booked for suspected criminal offenses, were basically fast tracked for deportation. And people in the immigrant rights community at the time were alarmed for lots of reasons. One, these people hadn't been adjudicated for criminal offenses. It was suspicion of criminal offenses driving them out of the country. I mean, people would get, pulled over for driving without a license, and the next thing you know, they're sent to another country while their kids are here in the United States. Just frankly, the dumbest, most brutal policy you could fathom until we got to jailing kids and separating them from their parents, right? And this was under the Obama administration, mind you. This was under a Democratic administration that we're seeing this normalization of attacks on immigrant rights. And the point I would make is that in the wake of that Secure Communities Initiative, collecting information from arrestee booking photos, what it turns out was actually happening, and we found this out through litigation, a bunch of groups sued the government and discovered that it was never a DHS program. It was never an ICE program. It was an FBI program the entire time, and it was never limited to immigrants. The point was to create a biometric database of all Americans, and that's what the FBI did, using us as bait. They used immigrants as punching bags to normalize programs that ultimately create authoritarianism. And so I don't see immigrant rights through the lens of protecting the rights of immigrants. I see immigrant rights through the lens of protecting the Constitution from authoritarians. And I think that resonates with many libertarians. They get that. They might not care about immigrants, but they care about the Constitution. And when it is explained, not just in policy, but also in my narrative, in my history as an advocate, how immigrant rights and the constitutional defense of Americans align in the face of a common foe, the institutional power that our Constitution was written to separate, split, and prevent from becoming tyrannical. That's a frame that, I've spoken at the Air Force Academy and had half the room come up to me after a panel on cybersecurity and say to me, "Thank you for being here. Like we need to hear this." And, even inside communities that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate support for a socialist agenda, there is a very widespread consensus among Americans on this layer of what I would describe as a constitutional commitment. You might not hear that consensus much in the body politic because few candidates or parties, frankly, run on those issues. The corporate parties, neither of them care with that set of alignment, but that's absolutely the root in which our campaign is grounded.
Yeah, I love that reframing of the issue. It reminds me of, this was a famous quote that came out of the Holocaust, and I think it applies to the basic foundation of rights being stripped away from first the minority groups, and then it eventually reaches the majority groups. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, then the Jews, and then they came for me. That whole line of, they're going to try and scapegoat a specific group that you might not care about, but that basically is going to strip your fundamental constitutional rights away that then is going to be applied to you later on. The last thing I really wanted to focus on, because I love the strategy that you've put forward and the issues that you're fighting for, is how do we actually actualize this race becoming a win? So I'd love to hear in your perspective, let's say I was a Nancy Pelosi supporter. I'm not, but let's say I am. What would you try to come to me to try and convince me to come to your side? And what would you advise your supporters to do when they're trying to recruit people for your team as well?
That's a great question as well. And, if I can take it in two stages, first, in terms of operationalizing the victory, the key here is flooding the phones. So we're making 6,000 phone calls. We made 6,000 phone calls last week, and our call number is growing about 15% every week. At that rate of growth, if we maintain it, we'll be contacting as many voters as we need to win the seat in November. And the key to that growth continuing is people who care about these issues joining us. A lot of us put in a lot of time on the phone with Bernie Sanders, and we often only had a few weeks to cover entire states. We still have 4 months left to cover a single city, which is to say this is imminently within reach, and we have the resources more than anyone has ever mustered to challenge Pelosi, and we still have 4 months left. And we're taking that fight to the master's house, as it were, to embrace the four corners of your question. What we say to Pelosi supporters and what we invite our supporters to say to Pelosi supporters is, I often think in these discursive settings, questions are more effective than statements. And I just ask, why do you support Pelosi? And usually that points to a set of answers that are grounded in rhetoric, not reality. She gets credit from most of her supporters for acts of political theater. And when we put it on the table, usually what they like about her is, oh, she's anti-Trump. And then that creates an opportunity to then deconstruct the myth, because in fact, she's not.
You're pro-Trump. Yeah, that's just such a silly reason to use in a Democrat versus Democrat race.
That's exactly right. But it's a predictable perspective among people who only understand politics through the lens of either Fox News or MSNBC. Right. And it's because those partisan outlets don't depict politics, but rather some game simulacrum of it, that people frankly get acculturated and sensitized to a false construction of reality. In the same way that Fox News is brainwashing its viewers, MSNBC does the same thing. And to people in those respective bubbles, the idea that the parties are actually collaborating in an ongoing assault on we, the people of the United States, demonstrated 50 different ways going back the last 70 years is, they'd never imagined that. It's not a, it sounds like a wild conspiracy theory unless you actually pay enough attention to look at the facts and see that on the very same day that Nancy Pelosi announced the impeachment of a criminal president, she signed his corporate trade agreement that undermines international environmental and labor standards. Unless you see that before she even became the Speaker of the House, her very first act as the Speaker of this congressional session was to impose conservative GOP accounting rules from the 90s that Democrats correctly always resisted until she became the Speaker. And when you have a Democratic Speaker imposing GOP rules, it does start to raise the question, who's playing on whose team here? And so to Pelosi supporters, we just ask them, why do you like her? Whatever it is, usually it leads to an opportunity to share some pieces of information that they haven't heard. And another way I'd put this, and this is a different track, and it depends on who you're talking to, but here in San Francisco, among the set of issues among our constituents here is absolutely an object of local consensus that gay rights and trans rights matter and that Black lives matter. And Nancy Pelosi hasn't shown up for them. She knelt wearing kente cloth to propose a bill, the Justice and Policing Act, that expands police budgets and expands police surveillance after 20 years of a policy legacy creating mass incarceration and paramilitary policing. And so the idea that an architect of the problems that are driving millions of Americans into the street is going to plausibly claim to be a bearer of the solution, just frankly, I think it insults everyone's intelligence. And another issue here with respect to gay rights, I was fighting in court for the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice 10 years. And I did this as a baby lawyer, cis hetero Muslim lawyer from Missouri, and Nancy Pelosi, as the Speaker of the House from San Francisco, California, could not be bothered to even acknowledge or support the equal rights of my neighbors until it took her another 10 years to show up. And ultimately, I think that is the way that we get votes in San Francisco, is noting that I stood for gay rights when it was unpopular and she didn't, even when she had institutional power and privilege. And we have a choice in San Francisco between a voice who will cross demographic lines to support and show solidarity with civil rights, regardless of who is impacted, and do it early, versus someone who will get dragged to civil rights commitments 10 years late because they're scared for their seat in their career. And I'm very proud to have fought for San Francisco's values for the last 20 years, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., and in cities everywhere in between. And I'm grateful for the chance to take our city's voice back to Congress, where it's been absent for entirely too long.
Yeah, I do love the approach first of, you have to understand where someone's coming from. You can't just sell straight from the get-go. You have to understand, why do they like the person in the first part, dispel any myths that are existing in place, and then show where you're leading compared to just being a follower of the movement. I think that is a really important aspect, especially for the specific issues you brought up that are so central to where you currently are occupying. The last question I'd love to ask you is, I think there is some fear from those who are we're at the top of the ticket during these presidential runs, like the Bernie Sanders, the Andrew Yang, who normally we would 100% say aligns with your platform, but they're a little bit, I'm going to editorialize here, but maybe scared of going against Nancy Pelosi. How would you address Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang to come out and support you to be able to help push your campaign across the finish line?
Well, if I had a minute with either one of them, and I've had not quite that long, but about 10 seconds with Bernie and maybe 5 minutes with Andrew once. And to each of them, I said, thank you for your work. I mean, that's my top line to each of them, frankly. I mean, I would love to have their support. It would be great. We have been supported by 3 former presidential candidates to this point. Lawrence Lessig, who was one of my former bosses. I was his teaching assistant when I was still in school at Stanford.
Very cool.
Yeah, I'm very proud of that endorsement. Is also Marianne Williamson and Senator Mike Gravel. I will say Senator Mike Gravel's endorsement humbles me enormously, because he was the reason that Daniel Ellsberg is a national hero and not in prison or in international exile like Edward Snowden. And I see in Edward Snowden's experience the result of not having a Mike Gravel in Congress. And Mike Gravel's endorsement of my campaign, is, again, as an immigrant, it makes me emotional, frankly, to have the support of a constitutional hero in his era, and to stand in his footsteps and to continue his work challenging executive secrecy on behalf of the people of the United States. Like, I'm here for it. That's what I was made for. And I'm eager to continue doing it. It's what I've been doing for 20 years, and I would like to do it on behalf of my neighbors. With respect to, I want to make sure I'm answering your question here, because I feel like I'm striking around it a little bit. Give it to me again, because I want to make sure that I'm striking right.
I just wanted to give the line straight. I think, frankly, they're a little bit scared going against Nancy Pelosi when they completely agree with you on the agenda.
Right, Bernie.
When you tell them to get over that fear and say that this is a winnable race.
Well, I have lots to say on it being a winnable race, but I'm not saying it to them. And maybe I'm challenging the premise of your question, but I put it this way. If Bernie Sanders showing up for me is going to limit his flexibility on Capitol Hill, I'd rather him stay out of our race and do his work in Washington, right? I'm not trying to get in the way of our movement. I'm running to support our movement, not create obstacles for my allies. And so, if it's inconvenient for them, I would just assume them do their thing. Now, that's a separate question from the viability of our race. And I depict that 10 different ways. Nancy Pelosi's never faced a Democrat in a November election ever in her career until now. And the way that she got in office was with the support of Republicans in San Francisco. And they're the ones who've kept her there for 30 years. So I don't think she frankly has a chance. Our field mobilization numbers reflect that. We're getting better than 60% yes rates on the phones when people are picking up. And at the rate of calls we're making and the rate of growth we're making with the amount of volunteer support we're getting, I don't think Pelosi has a chance. The fundraising momentum reflects this. We've raised as much money in the last week as it took me 3 months to raise in 2018. And in 2018, when I ran for this seat, I ran in the same cycle, very much on the same platform, with a sort of heavier emphasis on constitutional rights and surveillance and authoritarianism than Representative Ocasio-Cortez. I got as many votes in our primary here as she did in New York. And I'm back now to finish the job. And with the amount of support that we've gotten from across every part of San Francisco, every city in the Bay Area, every state in the union, Pelosi's only survived politically to this point because she's never had to defend her record. She's never faced another Democrat. She hasn't debated anyone in 30 years. And, the idea now that she has another Democrat on the ticket, I think is forcing the debate. And she might not show up for it, in which case I'll just take the seat. That's kind of what's happening now because she refuses to defend her, frankly, indefensible record. And as long as she refuses to defend her record, she's basically leaving the terrain uncontested. And, if she's going to pretend that her legislative record of passing tax breaks of $1.5 million for 43,000 millionaires in the middle of a pandemic without supporting rent and mortgage relief, if she's going to pretend that that legislative record is going to win her the votes of San Francisco, she has another thing coming. And in the past, no challengers had the resources to contend that narrative. We do. And we have the volunteers, we have the media attention, we have the social media platform and megaphones. And we have 4 months left to get the word out across San Francisco that this city, America's most progressive city, can be represented once again in Congress by someone who shares our city's visionary values.
Well, Shahid, I think that's a wonderful answer. I love the strategic pragmatism, the principles, the humility and experience that you've brought to today's conversation. I wanted to ask you, for the people who have enjoyed hearing you today, how can they be able to support your campaign? We have the link to your website scrolling across the bottom of the page. How are you looking for those people to help you out today?
Thank you so much for asking, John. People can sign up to volunteer. We'd love to invite you to phone bank with us or text bank or introduce us to your friends. I frequently speak on Zoom conferences with people from around the country supporting our campaign. You can contribute to the campaign if you're inclined. Our average contribution is only $20, and we're getting that support from over 20,000 people across the country. So whatever you can spare, we would love to put to use, and share our campaign on your social media profiles and in any relevant groups. If you're concerned about the future or disillusioned with the state of options before us in the presidential campaign, we can still move our movement's goals forward in the down ballot races. And I'm proud to be among them and an avenue for our outreach and our hope and our inspiration.
Yeah, I really encourage everyone to go do that. I know after this call, I'll be sending this video to family I have in your district. Hopefully that'll get you a couple of votes, and we'll also be sending some contributions down the way. So I hope everyone does similar. Share this video. If you liked it today, make sure you acknowledge that down below. And if you can, as he mentioned beforehand, I know it's hard in these economic times, please contribute to his campaign if you don't have the time to be able to volunteer in his organization. Shahid, I want to thank you so much for being here today. Rosebuds, I want to thank you all as well. The last thing I'm going to be saying is that we have a great schedule this upcoming week. We are going to be talking tomorrow with the Wolfpack organization. That's going to be a really great continuation of this so that we can bring more power to progressives running for office by getting money out of politics. And then we're going to be having a lot of interviews this week with our fellow contributors here at the organization who write great pieces at thehillofroses.com. So we have a lot to look forward to. Shahid, thank you once again for being here today. I really appreciated your time.
Great to be with you, man. Keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. Everyone, I hope you are staying safe out there. And as always, I hope you're staying rosy.